In the summer of 1947, southeastern New Mexico was quiet in a way that only vast, open land can be. The desert stretched outward for miles, flat and unforgiving, broken only by scrub brush, cattle fences, and the occasional dirt road disappearing into the horizon. At night, the sky above Roswell was clear and wide. Stars hung low, unobstructed by city lights or modern noise. The air cooled quickly after sunset, and the land settled into stillness. It was the kind of place where little happened, and where anything out of the ordinary stood out immediately. Roswell was a small agricultural town. Life moved slowly. Ranchers tended cattle. Families gathered around radios in the evenings. News from the outside world arrived days late, carried by newspapers and word of mouth. America itself was in a moment of transition. World War II had ended less than 2 years earlier. The country was adjusting to peace, but the shadow of conflict had not lifted. Military bases dotted the landscape, especially across the Southwest. Secrecy was routine. Classified projects were common. Silence was expected. Just outside Roswell sat Roswell Army Airfield, one of the most important military installations in the region. It was home to the 509th Bomb Group, the only unit in the world trained to deliver atomic weapons. Security around the base was strict. Personnel were accustomed to operating under orders they were not allowed to question. Yet beyond the fences of the airfield, the land returned quickly to emptiness. Ranchland stretched across Lincoln and Chavez counties, mostly uninhabited. Storms rolled in without warning, bringing lightning, heavy rain, and powerful winds that tore across the plains. In early July of that year, one such storm passed through the region. Thunder cracked across the desert. Rain fell hard and sudden. Lightning lit up the sky in sharp, blinding flashes. By morning, the storm had moved on, leaving behind wet ground, scattered debris, and the familiar calm of rural New Mexico. Nothing seemed unusual at first. No alarms were raised. No reports were filed. No one spoke of anything falling from the sky. But somewhere north of Roswell, on a remote sheep ranch, something lay scattered across the land. Something that did not resemble the remains of an aircraft. Something that did not look like the debris ranchers were used to finding after storms. At the time, no one knew it would become one of the most discussed incidents in modern history. No one knew the name Roswell would one day be synonymous with unanswered questions. And no one, standing beneath that wide desert sky, could have imagined how a quiet discovery would ripple outward for decades to come. For now, the desert remained silent. The fences stood unmoved. The base carried on as usual, and the land held its secret, waiting to be noticed. On a quiet stretch of land north of Roswell lived a rancher named William Mack Brazel. He was not a man drawn to mystery. His days followed a routine shaped by weather, livestock, and long hours under the sun. Like most ranchers in the region, he was familiar with what storms left behind. Broken fence posts, dead animals, pieces of wood or metal carried in by high winds. In early July of 1947, Brazel was checking his sheep after a night of heavy rain and lightning. The storm had been violent by local standards. Thunder echoed across the plains. The wind had howled through the open land. It was the kind of night that left debris scattered for miles. As Brazel moved across one of his grazing fields, he noticed something unusual. The ground ahead of him was littered with fragments. Not in a single pile, but spread across a wide area, hundreds of feet long. At first glance, it looked like wreckage. But as he got closer, It became clear this was not something he recognized. There were no large pieces, no engine parts, no wings, no recognizable framework. Instead, the field was covered with thin strips of material, small beams, foil-like sheets, and odd fragments that reflected light differently than ordinary metal. Brazel picked up one of the pieces. It was extremely light, lighter than anything he had handled before. He tried bending it. It flexed slightly, then returned to its original shape. He folded it. It did not crease. He crumpled it in his hand, then released it. According to later accounts, the material sprang back, smooth and unmarked. He found small beams, about the thickness of a pencil, but stronger than wood. Some had strange markings on them, symbols that did not resemble any language he knew. They were not printed. They appeared embedded, as if part of the material itself. There were no burn marks, no signs of fire, no smell of fuel. This troubled him. Aircraft sometimes went down in the region. Weather balloons were common. Military activity was not unusual. But this debris didn't match anything Brazel had seen in decades of ranch work. He gathered what he could and took it back to his ranch house. He showed it to his family. None of them could identify it. The pieces didn't behave like rubber, aluminum, or fabric. They didn't snap or tear the way ordinary materials did. For a time, Brazel said nothing. He went about his work, but the discovery stayed with him. The debris field was too large to ignore, and the materials were too strange to dismiss as trash blown in by a storm. Eventually, he decided the find should be reported, not to scientists, not to newspapers, but to the authorities he trusted to handle unusual discoveries. He drove into town. At the Chavez County Sheriff's Office, Brazel spoke with Sheriff George Wilcox. He described the debris and where he had found it. The sheriff listened carefully. After hearing Brazel's account, Wilcox contacted officials at Roswell Army Airfield. From that moment on, the situation changed. What had been a quiet ranch discovery began moving into military hands. Brazel was asked to guide officers back to the site. Trucks were dispatched. Personnel arrived. The debris field was examined. Pieces were collected. The area was secured. The rancher watched as unfamiliar men gathered the fragments he had found, loading them into vehicles under tight supervision. He would later say that he did not fully understand what he had stumbled upon, only that the response had been immediate and serious, and that whatever had fallen onto his land was no longer his concern. The desert returned to silence, but the story had begun to move. When military personnel began collecting the debris from the ranch, the focus quickly shifted from where it came from to what it was made of. Those who handled the material noticed the same things Brazel had. It didn't behave like anything familiar. The fragments were thin, light, and unusually strong. Some resembled foil, but unlike aluminum, they could not be torn, burned, or permanently bent. Others were shaped like small beams or struts, yet they weighed almost nothing in the hand. Several witnesses later described trying to damage the material. They struck it with tools. They attempted to burn it. They folded and twisted it. According to their accounts, the material resisted every attempt. When bent, it returned to its original shape. When struck, it showed no dents. When exposed to heat, it did not scorch or melt. There were no rivets, no bolts, no weld marks, no seams. This was unusual, even by military standards of the late 1940s. Aircraft wreckage was familiar to base personnel. Planes crashed. Balloons failed. Experimental equipment sometimes fell apart. All of it left recognizable traces: engines, wiring, insulation, fuel residue. This debris did not. Witnesses described small beams marked with symbols. The markings were not raised or painted. They appeared integrated into the material itself. Some said the symbols looked geometric. Others compared them to hieroglyphs. None could identify a language or pattern they recognized. No official photographs of these markings were ever released. What exists instead are descriptions, recalled years later, often cautiously, sometimes reluctantly. As the debris was gathered, it became clear that there was no single impact crater. The material was scattered across a wide area, as if whatever had fallen apart had done so in the air, rather than striking the ground in one piece. This detail mattered. A conventional crash usually leaves a focal point. An explosion, a burn scar, twisted metal concentrated in one location. Here, there was nothing like that. Just fragments. Thin, strange fragments spread across the desert. The material was transported from the ranch to Roswell Army Airfield. From there, some pieces were reportedly flown to other locations for further examination. What happened next is where accounts begin to diverge. Officially, the debris was described as the remains of a weather balloon. Later, this explanation was expanded to include Project Mogul, a classified balloon program designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. But those who claimed to have handled the material maintained that it did not resemble balloon equipment. Balloon debris, they said, was easy to identify. Rubber, balsa wood, aluminum foil, wires, tape. This was different. Some witnesses said they were instructed not to speak about what they had seen. Others said they were told the material was nothing unusual and that curiosity was unnecessary. Orders were followed. The debris disappeared into military custody. And for the moment, so did the questions. Outside the base, life in Roswell continued. The town remained largely unaware of what had been recovered from the nearby ranch. There were no public warnings, no road closures, no sense of urgency visible to civilians. Yet behind closed doors, something had already shifted. The material didn't fit expectations. And when something doesn't fit, it demands explanation. Soon, that explanation would be offered to the public. Once the debris had been secured, attention shifted from the ranch to the chain of command. At Roswell Army Airfield, unusual recoveries were not unheard of. Experimental equipment failed. Aircraft parts landed where they were not supposed to. Classified materials sometimes appeared without explanation. Procedures existed for all of it. But this case did not settle easily into those procedures. The initial report came from Sheriff George Wilcox, relayed after his meeting with Mac Brazel. From there, the information moved quickly to military intelligence officers at the base. The decision was made to involve higher-ranking personnel. Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group, was assigned to examine the debris. Marcel was not new to classified material. He had handled sensitive intelligence throughout the war. He was familiar with foreign aircraft, surveillance devices, and experimental technology. According to later statements attributed to Marcel, the debris he saw was unlike anything he had encountered. Marcel accompanied Brazel back to the ranch to inspect the site. Together, they surveyed the scattered field of fragments. Marcel reportedly collected pieces himself, examining them closely before arranging for their transport. The materials were taken to the base under guard. At this stage, the recovery was still quiet. No public announcement had been made. The matter was treated as internal military business, subject to routine secrecy. But then something changed. Rather than keeping the discovery classified, the base issued a press release. On July 8, 1947, Roswell Army Airfield released a short statement to local media outlets. It was brief and direct. It stated that personnel from the base had recovered a flying disc from a ranch near Roswell. The wording was precise. Flying disc. The term immediately captured attention. Within hours, newspapers picked up the story. Headlines spread across the country. Radio broadcasts repeated the phrase. The idea that the military had recovered a flying disc ignited public imagination at a time when reports of strange objects in the sky were already circulating. For many readers, the announcement seemed to confirm what rumors had suggested. Something unusual had fallen, and the military had it. Inside the base, however, the situation grew more complicated. Senior officers realized the statement had gone further than intended. The phrase flying disc carried implications no one was prepared to manage publicly. Questions began arriving from outside Roswell. Reporters called. Military officials requested clarification. Within hours, the narrative began to shift. Orders came down to correct the story. Later that same day, Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, addressed the press. He presented debris to reporters and identified it as the remains of a weather balloon. Photographs were taken. The explanation was simple. There had been a misunderstanding. The object was not a flying disc. It was ordinary military equipment. The retraction moved as quickly as the original announcement. Newspapers updated their stories. Headlines changed. The excitement faded almost as fast as it had appeared. Officially, the matter was closed. Yet for those involved in the recovery, the speed of the reversal raised questions. Why announce a flying disc at all? Why retract it so quickly? And why did the material shown to reporters appear different from what some witnesses claimed to have handled? These questions would linger. For now, the public was given a clear explanation. The object was a balloon. The case was resolved. Nothing extraordinary had occurred. But beneath that explanation, uncertainty remained. And for some, the story was only beginning. The morning of July 8th, 1947, began like any other in Roswell. The town woke to heat and dust. Radios hummed softly in kitchens and storefronts. Newspapers were delivered to doorsteps and counters, their headlines still dominated by post-war recovery and distant international concerns. Then the announcement appeared. A short press release from Roswell Army Airfield was distributed to local media. It did not contain technical detail. It did not offer explanation. It made a single, direct claim. Personnel from the base had recovered a flying disc from a ranch near Roswell. There was no speculation attached. No qualifiers. Just those words. For editors and broadcasters, the phrase was impossible to ignore. Flying disc was already part of the public vocabulary. In the weeks leading up to July, reports of strange objects in the sky had been appearing across the country. Pilots, civilians, and law enforcement officers had all described fast-moving discs that defied conventional aircraft behavior. Now, for the first time, the military appeared to be confirming one of those reports. Local newspapers ran the story immediately. The Roswell Daily Record printed the headline. Wire services picked it up. By afternoon, the story had spread nationwide. People read the words carefully. Recovered. Flying disc. Military. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the question many had been asking had an answer. Inside Roswell Army Airfield, the reaction was less certain. As calls came in from higher command and national media, it became clear that the press release had created a problem. The wording implied more than the military was prepared to explain. The story was moving faster than any internal review. Decisions were made quickly. Senior officers intervened. The debris was transported to Fort Worth. Brigadier General Roger Ramey prepared to address the press. The language shifted from discovery to correction. Later that same day, reporters were shown fragments laid out on the floor of Ramey's office. The materials were described as parts of a weather balloon. Photographs were taken of officers smiling beside the debris. The explanation was clear and uncomplicated. There had been confusion. The object was not unusual. The situation had been misunderstood. The national narrative changed almost instantly. Newspapers updated their headlines. Radio broadcasters corrected their reports. What had seemed extraordinary in the morning was dismissed by evening as a simple mistake. To the public, the case appeared closed. But for those who had read both versions of the story, something didn't sit comfortably. Why had a base responsible for the most sensitive military operations in the country used the phrase flying disc at all? Why had intelligence officers been involved if the object was ordinary? And why had the correction come so quickly, with no detailed explanation of the initial error? These questions were not asked loudly at the time. The country was tired of war. People accepted the official statement. Life moved on. Yet the press release had already done its work. It had placed Roswell into the national consciousness. It had created a record that could not be erased. And it had ensured that, decades later, the events of that week would still be examined line by line. For now, the military's explanation stood. The flying disc had become a weather balloon. The story, officially, was over. But for those who paid attention, the speed and certainty of that conclusion only deepened the mystery. By the afternoon of July 8, 1947, the story had already begun to reverse itself. What had started as a confident announcement from Roswell Army Airfield was now being carefully undone. The phrase flying disc, so prominently used just hours earlier, was quietly withdrawn. In its place came something far more familiar. A weather balloon. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, speaking from Fort Worth, addressed reporters with a composed certainty. The object recovered near Roswell, he said, was nothing unusual. It was part of a balloon-based project used for atmospheric research. Any confusion, he explained, had been the result of misidentification. Photographs accompanied the statement. They showed debris laid out neatly on the floor. Thin sticks, rubber material, foil, tape, ordinary components, presented plainly and without secrecy. Officers posed beside the fragments, relaxed, almost casual. The message was clear. There was no mystery. There had been no crash. Nothing extraordinary had occurred. For most of the public, this was enough. The correction came from a senior officer. The explanation was simple. And in 1947, trust in military authority was still largely intact. Newspapers printed the update. Radio announcers moved on to other stories. But among those directly involved, the retraction raised quiet concerns. Major Jesse Marcel, who had examined the debris firsthand, later stated that the material shown to reporters was not the same as what he had recovered from the ranch. According to his account, the fragments displayed in Fort Worth looked like ordinary equipment. The pieces he remembered handling did not. At the time, Marcel did not challenge the explanation publicly. Orders had been given. The narrative had been set, and questioning it was not an option. Mac Brazel, the rancher who had found the debris, was also brought into the revised story. After spending time with military officials, He gave interviews describing the material as consistent with a weather balloon. His earlier descriptions were softened. The unusual qualities were no longer emphasized. Whether this change came from clarification or pressure is something that would be debated decades later. What was certain was how quickly the shift had occurred. In less than 24 hours, the story had moved from recovery of a flying disc to dismissal as a routine balloon incident. There was no extended investigation made public, no technical briefing, no follow-up explanation for the initial wording. The speed itself became part of the puzzle. Why had the base acted so decisively in both directions? Why had the original announcement been released without confirmation? And why had the correction required such careful staging? Officially, the answers were straightforward. A mistake had been made. It had been corrected. The case was closed. But beneath that closure, something lingered. The retraction did not erase the original statement. It existed in print, preserved in newspapers and archives. It remained a documented moment when the military had publicly acknowledged something it later denied. As days passed, Roswell returned to normal. The base resumed operations. The ranch quieted. The debris was no longer discussed. Silence settled over the incident. And in that silence, questions began to take shape. After the retraction, the town of Roswell grew quiet. The headlines had come and gone. The brief moment of national attention faded quickly, replaced by more pressing concerns of the time. In the summer of 1947, people were focused on rebuilding their lives after the war. A story about a balloon, even one that had briefly been called a flying disc, did not linger for long. On the surface, life returned to normal. At Roswell Army Airfield, operations continued without interruption. Personnel followed their routines. Aircraft came and went. Security remained tight, but nothing outwardly suggested that anything unusual had occurred. Beyond the base, the ranchland returned to stillness. Mac Brazel went back to his work. He repaired fences damaged by the storm. He tended to his sheep. To neighbors, he appeared unchanged. But those who spoke with him later would recall that he became far more cautious in his words. When asked about the debris, his answers were brief. He no longer described strange materials. He no longer mentioned markings. He referred only to a weather balloon. According to some accounts, Brazel told friends that he had been advised not to speak further about the incident. Others claimed he had been warned that continued discussion could cause trouble. There is no official record of such warnings, only recollections shared years later. What is documented is that Brazel stopped talking. So did others. Military personnel who had been involved in the recovery did not give interviews. No detailed reports were released to the public. Requests for information were met with silence or simple repetition of the official explanation. The debris itself was gone. No fragments were returned to the ranch. No materials were displayed publicly beyond what had been shown in Fort Worth. Whatever had been collected disappeared into military custody, and no inventory was made available. For decades, the incident remained dormant. It was mentioned occasionally in UFO literature, often as a footnote, overshadowed by newer sightings and reports. To many, Roswell was a minor curiosity, a misunderstanding inflated by rumor. But among those who had been close to the event, the quiet carried weight. Some witnesses later said they felt uneasy about how quickly the matter had been closed. Others described a sense that the story had been deliberately buried, not with force, but with indifference. Silence can be effective. When nothing more is said, questions fade. Memories dull. Records gather dust. Over time, absence becomes explanation. And for nearly 30 years, that is what happened. Roswell was rarely discussed. The desert kept its distance. The base kept its records. And the incident settled into obscurity. Until, slowly, it began to surface again. Years after the events of 1947, the United States Air Force offered a detailed explanation for what had fallen near Roswell. According to official reports, the debris recovered from the ranch was part of a classified military program known as Project Mogul. At the time of the incident, Project Mogul was top secret. Its purpose was not related to aircraft or weapons, but to surveillance. The project used high-altitude balloons equipped with microphones designed to detect sound waves from potential Soviet nuclear tests. These balloons were experimental. They were large, fragile, and difficult to control. Strong winds could carry them far off course. When they failed, they scattered debris across wide areas, often in remote locations. Because the program was classified, military personnel were instructed to disguise its true purpose. Publicly, Mogul balloons were described simply as weather balloons. The materials used, including reflective foil, rubber components, balsa wood, and reinforced tape, were unfamiliar to most civilians. According to the Air Force, this secrecy explained both the unusual appearance of the debris and the confusion surrounding its recovery. In reports released in the 1990s, the Air Force stated that the original flying disc announcement had been a mistake made by personnel who were unaware of Project Mogul's true nature. Once senior officers became involved, the story was corrected to protect the classified program. From an official standpoint, the case was straightforward. A secret balloon had crashed. Its debris was misidentified. The error was corrected. No further explanation was necessary. The Air Force emphasized that no extraterrestrial craft had been recovered. No alien materials had been found. No bodies had been retrieved. The incident, they said, had been misinterpreted over time due to fading memories, exaggeration, and the influence of popular culture. Project Mogul, once declassified, became the foundation for the government's position on Roswell. Yet even within that explanation, questions remained. Project Mogul balloons were not unknown to all military personnel. Some officers at Roswell Army Airfield had experience with balloon-based projects. Others were familiar with radar reflectors and surveillance equipment. This raised the question of why the debris had caused such confusion in the first place. Additionally, the materials shown in Fort Worth photographs appeared ordinary, but witnesses described debris that behaved in ways inconsistent with balloon components. The Air Force acknowledged these discrepancies but attributed them to faulty recollection. According to the reports, memories recorded decades later were unreliable, influenced by time and external narratives. The explanation was thorough. It addressed the debris. It addressed the secrecy. It addressed the confusion. For the government, the matter was resolved. But for those who continued to study the incident, the explanation did not fully close the case. It provided a framework, but not certainty. Official answers rarely satisfy everyone, especially when an event has left behind unanswered details. For nearly 3 decades after the events of 1947, Roswell remained largely absent from public discussion. Then, in the late 1970s, the silence began to break. Researchers interested in unidentified flying objects started revisiting older cases. They searched newspaper archives. They interviewed retired military personnel. They looked for incidents that had occurred before the term UFO had entered common use. Roswell surfaced again. As attention returned to the town, Individuals who had been present in 1947 began to speak. Some had waited years before sharing what they remembered. Others said they had never been asked until that point. Their accounts varied in detail, but certain themes repeated. Several witnesses described materials that did not behave like ordinary metal. They spoke of fragments that were light yet strong, flexible yet unbreakable. Some recalled pieces that could be folded without leaving marks. Others remembered beams with unfamiliar markings. Former military personnel described being ordered to remain silent. Some said they were warned not to discuss the recovery. Others recalled being told simply that the incident was classified and not to be mentioned again. There were also disagreements. Not all witnesses described the same debris. Not all accounts aligned perfectly. Some details conflicted. Timelines blurred. Locations shifted slightly from one memory to another. This inconsistency became a central point of skepticism. Critics argued that memories formed decades earlier could not be trusted. They pointed out that human recollection changes over time, influenced by repetition, suggestion, and cultural narratives. Supporters countered that while minor details differed, the core descriptions were strikingly similar. Independent witnesses, many of whom had not known each other, described materials and circumstances that shared common characteristics. One figure stood out in these later interviews. Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer involved in the original recovery, spoke publicly about the incident before his death. He stated that the debris he handled was not consistent with a weather balloon. He described material that could not be cut or burned and emphasized that what had been presented to the press was not what he remembered collecting. Marcel did not claim to know what the object was. He only claimed to know what it was not. Other witnesses echoed that sentiment. They did not offer explanations. They did not describe alien beings. They spoke only about what they had seen, handled, or been told at the time. As more testimonies emerged, Roswell shifted from a closed case to a reopened question. Books were written. Interviews were recorded. Conferences discussed the incident in detail. Each new account added another layer, but not a definitive answer. The longer the story was examined, the more complex it became. Official explanations existed. Personal recollections persisted. Between them lay a gap, filled with uncertainty. And in that gap, the Roswell incident found new life. As more witnesses came forward in the late 20th century, the Roswell story began to take a new shape. Until then, most discussion had focused on debris, fragments, materials, scattered wreckage. But now, some accounts went further. They spoke not just of pieces, but of a structure. According to these later testimonies, the debris field discovered on Mac Brazel's ranch may not have been the only site involved. Several individuals claimed there had been a second location, farther away, where something more intact had come down. This second site, they said, was not a wide scatter of fragments, but a concentrated area where an object had struck the ground. Witnesses described a craft, not an aircraft in the conventional sense, but a single object, metallic in appearance, partially damaged, but largely whole. Some said it was disc-shaped. Others described it as oval or rounded, with smooth surfaces and no visible seams. There were no wings, no propellers, no tail section. Those who claimed to have seen it emphasized its lack of familiar features. According to these accounts, military personnel secured this second site quickly. Roads were closed. Armed guards were posted. The area was cleared before civilians could approach. The craft, they said, was transported away under heavy security. Where it was taken remains unclear. Some claimed it was moved to Roswell Army Airfield. Others said it was flown elsewhere almost immediately. No official records have ever confirmed the recovery of an intact object. Critics point out that these claims emerged decades after the event. They argue that no contemporary documentation supports the existence of a second crash site or a recovered craft. Supporters counter that if such a recovery had occurred, it would have been classified from the start. Records, they suggest, would not have been made public. What complicates the issue further is the lack of agreement among witnesses. Descriptions of the craft differ. Locations vary slightly. Timelines are inconsistent. Yet certain elements appear repeatedly. A smooth metallic surface. Unusual construction. A rapid military response. No witness claimed to have examined the craft closely. Most accounts describe brief glimpses, seen from a distance or under guarded conditions. No photographs exist. No physical evidence has been produced. The claims rely entirely on testimony. Because of this, the idea of a recovered craft remains one of the most contested aspects of the Roswell incident. It sits at the boundary between what can be documented and what can only be described. The official position remains unchanged. No craft was recovered. No vehicle of unknown origin was found. Only balloon debris was collected. Yet the persistence of these claims has ensured that the question remains open. If there was no craft, then the story ends with debris. If there was, then Roswell becomes something else entirely. For now, the accounts exist without resolution. And with them comes the next, more controversial claim. Alongside stories of a recovered craft, another set of claims began to surface. These accounts were quieter at first, shared cautiously and often reluctantly. They were not part of the original reports from 1947, nor did they appear in early newspaper coverage. Instead, they emerged decades later, as witnesses grew older and less concerned with consequences. According to these later testimonies, the Roswell incident involved not only debris or a damaged object, but bodies. The individuals who made these claims described small beings found near the alleged second crash site. They were said to be humanoid in shape, but not human. Short in stature, slender, with disproportionately large heads and thin limbs. These descriptions varied. Some witnesses said there were 3 bodies. Others said 4. A few described one that appeared injured but alive. The details were inconsistent, and no single account matched another exactly. According to these claims, the bodies were recovered by military personnel and transported away from the site under heavy guard. Some witnesses alleged the bodies were taken to Roswell Army Airfield. Others believe they were flown to different facilities for examination. One frequently cited location was the base hospital. Several individuals who claimed to have worked in or around medical facilities at the time later stated that unusual security measures had been put in place. They described sealed rooms, restricted access, and armed guards stationed in hallways. None of these accounts were documented at the time. There were no photographs, no medical records, no official reports. The Air Force has consistently denied that any bodies were recovered at Roswell, human or otherwise. In official reports, these claims were attributed to misidentification. According to the government, some witnesses may have encountered anthropomorphic test dummies used in high-altitude experiments during the 1950s. Others may have confused human remains from unrelated accidents with the Roswell incident. Critics of the body claims point to several issues. First, the timing. Many of the accounts emerged long after the event, raising concerns about memory distortion. Second, the lack of corroboration. No physical evidence has ever been produced. Third, the variability in descriptions, which undermines consistency. Supporters argue that secrecy surrounding such a recovery would have been extreme. They suggest that documentation would have been suppressed and witnesses discouraged from speaking. Between these positions lies uncertainty. What is known as this? No contemporary records mention bodies. No verified evidence supports their recovery. And yet, the claims persist. They remain one of the most controversial aspects of the Roswell narrative, dividing researchers sharply. For some, they represent the final piece of a hidden story. For others, they mark the point where speculation overtakes fact. Because of this, the claims of bodies are best understood not as proof, but as part of how the Roswell story evolved over time. As the incident grew in cultural significance, so too did the scope of what people believed it might represent. And with that expansion came deeper questions about secrecy, authority, and memory. Questions that would soon turn toward the military itself. To understand how the Roswell incident was handled, it is necessary to understand the military environment of the time. In 1947, the United States was entering a new phase of global tension. World War II had ended, but peace was uncertain. The Cold War was beginning to take shape, and national security had become a central concern. Secrecy was not unusual. It was standard practice. Military installations operated under strict compartmentalization. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. Personnel were trained to follow orders without explanation and to remain silent about classified matters, even after leaving service. Roswell Army Airfield was not an ordinary base. It housed the 509th Bomb Group, the only unit in the world capable of delivering atomic weapons. Security protocols there were among the strictest in the country. Intelligence officers, counterintelligence agents, and classified materials were a daily part of operations. If an unknown object had been recovered, regardless of its origin, the response would have been immediate and controlled. The first priority would have been containment, securing the site, restricting access, collecting all material. The second priority would have been identification, determining whether the object posed a threat, assessing whether it belonged to a foreign power, evaluating its technological significance. In this context, rapid action would not have been unusual, neither would secrecy. Even if the object had been something ordinary, such as experimental equipment, the military would still have acted cautiously. Classified programs were often disguised to prevent adversaries from learning their true purpose. This explains, at least in part, why local authorities were quickly removed from the situation and why civilians were discouraged from involvement. It also explains why communication with the public was limited and carefully controlled. What it does not explain entirely is the initial language used in the press release. The use of the term flying disc suggests that, at least at one point, uncertainty existed even within the base. Whether this uncertainty came from unfamiliar materials, incomplete information, or simple miscommunication remains unclear. Military procedures are designed to eliminate ambiguity, but they rely on accurate input. When something falls outside established categories, confusion can occur, even in disciplined systems. In 1947, there were no protocols for unidentified aerial phenomena as they are understood today. Radar technology was primitive. Surveillance systems were limited. The concept of unexplained craft was not formally acknowledged. Faced with an unfamiliar recovery, officers may have relied on descriptive language rather than technical classification. Once higher command became involved, that ambiguity was no longer acceptable. The narrative was simplified. The explanation was standardized. The matter was closed. From a procedural standpoint, this approach made sense. It reduced speculation. It protected classified programs. It maintained public confidence. Whether it also concealed something more is a question that cannot be answered by procedure alone. What can be said is that the military response to Roswell was consistent with how sensitive matters were handled at the time. Swift, controlled, quiet. And once silence was established, it was rarely broken. Until years later, when the incident would be re-examined not as a matter of procedure, but as a question of history. For decades after 1947, the Roswell incident remained officially unresolved only in the public imagination. From the government's perspective, the case had been closed almost as soon as it began. That changed. In the early 1990s, renewed public interest, fueled by books, documentaries, and witness testimonies, prompted calls for a formal review. Questions were raised in Congress. Requests were made under the Freedom of Information Act. The Air Force was asked to account for the contradictions surrounding Roswell. In response, the United States Air Force initiated an internal investigation. The goal, according to official statements, was to determine whether any records supported claims of a crashed extraterrestrial craft or recovered bodies. Investigators reviewed historical documents, interviewed surviving personnel, and examined classified programs active during the late 1940s. In 1994, the Air Force released its first report. The conclusion was clear. No evidence of an alien craft was found. No extraterrestrial materials were recovered. The debris near Roswell was attributed to Project Mogul. The report acknowledged that Mogul had been classified at the time, which explained why the true purpose of the balloons had not been disclosed in 1947. According to the Air Force, this secrecy led to confusion and misidentification. However, the report did not fully address claims of bodies. As those claims continued to circulate, the Air Force conducted a second investigation. In 1997, a follow-up report was released, focusing specifically on witness accounts describing recovered beings. This report offered a different explanation. According to the Air Force, many of the body-related testimonies could be attributed to memories of unrelated military programs. In particular, it pointed to high-altitude experiments conducted in the 1950s that used anthropomorphic test dummies. These dummies were designed to study the effects of high-altitude ejections on the human body. They were roughly human-shaped, transported in secrecy, and sometimes recovered in remote locations. The Air Force suggested that over time, memories of these recoveries may have been mistakenly associated with the Roswell incident. The report emphasized the unreliability of long-term memory, especially when events are retold repeatedly over decades. It argued that cultural exposure to UFO narratives may have influenced how witnesses recalled past experiences. With these explanations, the government considered the Roswell case closed once again. From an official standpoint, the matter had been thoroughly examined. Yet the investigations did not satisfy everyone. Critics noted that many of the witnesses cited in the reports disputed the explanations offered. Some pointed out inconsistencies in timelines, noting that test dummy programs occurred years after 1947. Others questioned why certain records were missing or heavily redacted. Supporters of the official position argued that the reports were comprehensive and based on available evidence. They maintained that no credible proof of an extraterrestrial event had ever been presented. Between these views, Roswell remained suspended. The government had spoken, the witnesses had spoken, the records had been reviewed, and still, the story did not end. Because official explanations, even when detailed, do not always resolve historical uncertainty, especially when the original event was brief, confusing, and handled in secrecy. Roswell had become more than an incident. It had become a symbol, and symbols, once formed, are difficult to dismantle. By the late 1990s, the Roswell incident had been examined, explained, and officially closed more than once. And yet, it refused to fade. Unlike many historical events that settle into consensus over time, Roswell moved in the opposite direction. With each passing decade, it seemed to grow more complex, not less. Part of this persistence came from timing. Roswell occurred at a moment when aviation technology was advancing rapidly, but public understanding of that technology lagged behind. Radar was new. High-altitude research was unfamiliar. Classified programs were widespread, but invisible. In that environment, uncertainty was easy to cultivate. Another factor was documentation. The original incident lasted only days. Records were limited. Much of what existed was classified, destroyed, or never publicly released. This left gaps. And where gaps exist, interpretation follows. Witness testimony played a central role. Some accounts remained consistent over time. Others changed subtly. Small differences became points of debate. Supporters focused on similarities. Critics focused on contradictions. Both sides found enough material to reinforce their positions. Roswell also benefited from distance. As years passed, the immediate pressures of 1947 faded. Witnesses retired. Military secrecy loosened. Cultural attitudes toward authority shifted. What once felt dangerous to discuss began to feel safer. At the same time, interest in unidentified aerial phenomena grew. Sightings were reported around the world. Government programs were quietly acknowledged. The language changed. UFOs became UAPs. Serious institutions began to address questions they had once dismissed. Against that backdrop, Roswell took on new meaning. It was no longer just an isolated incident. It was reframed as a possible starting point, the first moment when something unknown entered the modern record. Popular culture amplified this shift. Books, films, television programs, and documentaries returned to Roswell repeatedly. Each retelling added layers. Some emphasized secrecy. Others focused on witnesses. Some leaned toward speculation. Others toward skepticism. The result was not clarity, but endurance. Roswell endured because it sat at the intersection of multiple uncertainties. Uncertainty about technology. Uncertainty about government transparency. Uncertainty about memory. And perhaps most importantly, uncertainty about humanity's place in the universe. The official explanations answered specific questions, but they did not address the broader unease that the incident represented. They explained what the debris might have been, but not why the initial response had unfolded the way it did. They closed the case procedurally. They did not close it emotionally. For many, Roswell remained unresolved not because of what was known, but because of what could not be verified or dismissed with absolute certainty. The story lived on in that space. Not as proof, not as confirmation, but as a question that had never been fully put to rest. And as long as that question remained, Roswell would continue to return, quietly and persistently, to public attention. As the Roswell incident continued to be examined, one distinction became increasingly important. the difference between what can be verified and what cannot. Over time, the story accumulated layers of testimony, interpretation, and speculation. Separating these layers is difficult, but not impossible. Some elements of the incident are supported by documentation. Others rely entirely on personal recollection. There is no dispute that something fell near Roswell in July of 1947. This is supported by newspaper articles, military statements, and first-hand accounts from local residents. The recovery of debris from a ranch north of Roswell is a documented fact. It is also verifiable that Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release describing the object as a flying disc. This statement exists in print and is preserved in historical archives. The retraction that followed is equally verifiable. Photographs from Fort Worth show debris identified as balloon material. Statements from senior officers describe the incident as a misunderstanding. These records are part of the official historical record. What cannot be verified is the nature of the material beyond those photographs. No physical fragments from the original recovery are available for independent examination. No samples exist in public collections. Without physical evidence, claims about unusual properties cannot be tested or confirmed. Similarly, the existence of a second crash site cannot be verified. There are no contemporary documents describing such a location. No maps. No photographs. No official reports. The claims rest entirely on testimony provided decades later. The same is true for claims of recovered bodies. There are no medical records. No transport logs. No official acknowledgments. The Air Force has denied these claims, and no independent evidence has surfaced to contradict that denial. Witness testimony occupies a complex space. Some accounts are detailed and consistent. Others conflict. Memory is not static. It changes with time, retelling, and context. Psychologists have long noted that confidence in a memory does not guarantee its accuracy. At the same time, dismissing all testimony outright overlooks the human element of history. Many events, especially those handled in secrecy, survive primarily through personal accounts. Roswell sits at that intersection. Documented facts provide a framework. Testimony fills in the gaps. Speculation attempts to connect the two. What remains is an incomplete picture. The official explanation answers some questions, but not all. Witness accounts raise possibilities, but do not provide proof. Between these positions lies uncertainty. This uncertainty is not evidence of deception, nor is it evidence of confirmation. It is simply the result of limited information. Roswell is not unique in this way. Many historical events, especially those involving secrecy and rapid decision-making, leave behind fragmented records. What makes Roswell different is the meaning attached to those fragments. They are not just pieces of debris or lines in a report. They are symbols, interpreted differently depending on perspective. And without new evidence, that interpretation remains open. Today, the land north of Roswell looks much as it did in 1947. The desert remains wide and quiet. Low brush spreads across the plains. Fence lines cut through open space. Dirt roads still wind toward the horizon, leading to places where there are no signs, no markers, and no indication that anything unusual ever happened there. There is no crater. There is no memorial. There is no visible trace of debris. Whatever fell on that ranch decades ago left no lasting mark on the land itself. Roswell, however, has changed. The town has grown accustomed to its place in history. Street names, storefronts, and museums reference the event openly now. Souvenirs fill shop windows. Tourists arrive curious, some skeptical, some hopeful. For many visitors, Roswell represents certainty, a belief already formed. For others, it is simply a question made physical, a location tied to an unresolved story. Yet beyond the town's public face, daily life continues quietly. Residents go to work. Ranchers still tend livestock. The desert stretches on, indifferent to its reputation. Roswell Army Airfield no longer exists in the form it did in 1947. The base was renamed and later closed. Its runways are silent. Its buildings repurposed or abandoned. The intense military presence that once defined the area has faded. And still, no new evidence has emerged. No recovered material has been released. No documents confirming a craft have surfaced. No physical proof has been presented. What remains are accounts, archives, and unanswered questions. Researchers continue to search. Some walk the land, comparing old descriptions to modern maps. Others dig through declassified files, looking for overlooked details. Most find nothing definitive. The desert gives no answers. It holds no record of what passed through it. Wind erases tracks. Time smooths disturbances. Whatever happened in 1947 exists now only in memory and record. Standing there today, it is difficult to imagine the urgency of those few days in July. The quick decisions, the sudden attention, the silence that followed. The land offers no clues, only space. And, in that space, the Roswell incident remains suspended between past and present, unresolved and unchanged. After everything that has been said, recorded, corrected, and revisited, one question remains. What really fell near Roswell in 1947? It is a simple question, but one that resists a simple answer. The historical record provides fragments. A press release, a retraction, photographs, official reports. Together, they outline a sequence of events, but not their full meaning. Witnesses add texture to that outline. Their memories describe materials that behaved strangely. Their recollections speak of confusion, urgency, and silence. Some accounts align, others diverge. All are shaped by time. The official explanation offers clarity, but only within defined limits. Project Mogul accounts for secrecy. Weather balloons explain debris. Test dummies address later claims. From an institutional perspective, the answers are sufficient. And yet, for many, they feel incomplete. Not because they prove something extraordinary occurred, but because they do not fully explain how uncertainty entered the story in the first place. Why did trained military personnel describe the object as a flying disc? Why was the initial response so confident and the retraction so immediate? Why were some witnesses so certain that what they handled was unfamiliar? These questions do not require an extraordinary answer. They simply require acknowledgement. History is often shaped by moments of confusion, by decisions made quickly and quietly. When records are limited and silence follows, uncertainty becomes permanent. Roswell exists in that uncertainty. It does not stand as proof of visitors from another world, nor does it stand as a resolved misunderstanding. It exists between those positions. For some, Roswell represents distrust of official narratives. For others, it represents the limits of human memory. For many, it represents a deeper curiosity about what might exist beyond what we understand. Perhaps the most important aspect of Roswell is not what happened, but why the question persists. Why, after decades of explanation, denial, and reinvestigation, does the story remain unfinished? The answer may lie not in the debris, the witnesses, or the reports, but in the nature of unanswered questions themselves. They endure. They settle quietly into the background of collective memory. They resurface when conditions change. They refuse to disappear completely. Roswell is one such question. And like all enduring questions, it does not demand belief. It simply remains. As night settles once more over the New Mexico desert, the land returns to stillness. The wind moves gently across the plains. Stars reappear in the dark sky, steady and unchanged. The same horizon that witnessed uncertainty decades ago now holds only silence. Whatever happened near Roswell in the summer of 1947 belongs to the past. The people involved have grown old or passed on. The base has closed. The debris, whatever it was, is gone. What remains is the story, not as an answer, but as a record of questions asked and left unresolved. The desert does not speak. It does not confirm. It does not deny. It simply endures. In that endurance, the Roswell incident continues to exist, not as an event frozen in time, but as a quiet presence in the background of history. A moment when certainty gave way to ambiguity, and ambiguity settled into memory. There is no need to resolve it here. Some stories are not meant to conclude. They are meant to be remembered, considered, and then allowed to rest. As the hours pass and the desert grows cooler, the urgency of explanation fades. The mind drifts. The details soften. What remains is calm. A ranch. A storm. A discovery. A silence. And a question left gently unanswered. For now, there is nothing more to add. The night is quiet. The land is still. And the story, at last, can be left where it belongs. Good night.